Welcome back to the Sleepy Poker Masterclass Beginner to Master. In this 11th lesson, we'll explore the power of bet sizing in Texas Hold'em. You'll learn how to size your bets with purpose, how each chip you place in the pot communicates strength, balance, or intent. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand how professionals use sizing to guide decisions, disguise ranges, and control the rhythm of the game. Chapter 1. The Purpose of Bet Sizing. Every chip placed into the pot carries a message. Bet sizing is how players communicate in poker. It defines intent, creates pressure, and controls the rhythm of a hand. Understanding why we size bets a certain way transforms every decision from guesswork into deliberate strategy. At its core, bet sizing serves three purposes: to extract value, to deny equity, and to bluff effectively. Every action, whether a small probe or a large overbet, fits somewhere on that spectrum. The amount you choose is never random. It shapes both the math of the hand and how your opponent perceives you. Bet sizing influences pot odds, determining what price you offer your opponent to continue. A smaller bet gives them favorable odds to call, keeping weaker hands in play. A larger bet demands more commitment, forcing folds from all but the strongest holdings. The balance between these outcomes defines your long-term profit. Sizing also dictates psychological control. Small bets invite conversation. They keep opponents curious, drawing them into the story of the hand. Large bets end the conversation, asserting dominance and forcing hard decisions. The best players switch between these tones deliberately, creating rhythm in their play that mirrors their understanding of both probability and emotion. Another purpose of sizing is information management. When you size consistently, opponents struggle to read your hand strength. When you vary sizes intentionally, you manipulate perception. Each sizing tells a version of your story, controlled, believable, and strategically aligned with your range. Bet sizing also affects future streets. A flop bet sets up the size of the turn pot, which determines how much remains for the river. Professionals plan these sequences like architects, ensuring that each bet builds toward the desired outcome. Poor sizing early often traps players later, either leaving too little to threaten effectively or too much to bluff credibly. Finally, sizing defines tempo. In a calm hand, a sudden overbet changes the emotional temperature. In a tense spot, a quiet small bet can diffuse fear and invite mistakes. Great sizing makes opponents uncomfortable without appearing reckless. Bet sizing is not just mathematics, it's conversation. Every number you choose becomes a sentence in the language of poker. The players who speak that language fluently can make weaker hands look strong hands look balanced, and every decision feel inevitable. Chapter 2. Understanding pot geometry. Poker hands unfold like geometric structures. Each bet builds upon the last, shaping the pot's size and the ratios that guide optimal decisions. This relationship, known as pot geometry, is the foundation of advanced bet sizing. Pot geometry describes how the pot expands across streets based on your chosen bet sizes. When you bet a certain percentage of the pot, it determines not only immediate risk and reward, but also how large the pot will be later. Understanding these ratios helps you plan your entire hand rather than reacting street by street. Let's begin with a simple example. Suppose the pot is 100 chips. You bet half the pot, your opponent calls, and now the pot becomes 200. If you bet half again on the turn and get another call, the river pot grows to 400. Each street doubles the total. This predictable growth allows you to calculate stack-to-pot ratio, or SPR, the amount remaining in stacks compared to the pot size. SPR tells you how much room you have to maneuver in later streets. Larger bets early create low SPR situations, where players are more committed. This is ideal when you hold strong hands and want the money in quickly. Smaller bets preserve high SPR, giving room for post-flop skill and bluffs. Skilled players adjust sizing based on both stack depth and hand strength, shaping the geometry that fits their plan. Pot geometry also clarifies betting sequences. For instance, if your goal is to move all in by the river, you can calculate the correct progression to achieve that outcome. A 75% flop bet, followed by a similar turn bet, usually leaves a pot-sized shove on the river. These planned sequences prevent awkward overbets or underbets later. Understanding pot growth also protects against imbalanced lines. Betting too small on early streets often forces massive bets later that scare opponents away. Overbetting early leaves no space for bluffing on future streets. Geometry keeps everything proportional, ensuring your narrative stays consistent and believable. Finally, pot geometry influences psychological pressure. When opponents realize how quickly the pot has grown, their emotional investment increases. They feel pot committed, and small mistakes become large ones. By mastering geometry, you're not just building pots, you're building tension. In poker, every bet is architecture. Pot geometry is the blueprint. Once you understand how structure shapes opportunity, you stop building hands by instinct and start building them by design. Chapter 3: Sizing for Value. The essence of poker is simple. You want worse hands to call and better hands to fold. Bet sizing for value achieves the first part of that equation. It's how you extract the maximum profit when you're ahead, without scaring opponents out of the pot. Value betting begins with range awareness. You're not betting because you have a good hand. You're betting because your hand is ahead of your opponent's calling range. That difference defines how much you can reasonably expect to win. The best players think not just about their own strength, but about what hands can realistically call a bet. Sizing for value requires balance between greed and invitation. If you bet too large, weaker hands retreat, and you win only the pot as it stands. If you bet too small, you invite calls but lose potential earnings. The perfect value bet sits at the psychological edge, large enough to build the pot, but small enough to keep curiosity alive. To find this balance, imagine your opponent's mindset. What would make them call with second pair? What size feels like a test rather than a threat? Successful value bets feel like opportunities to the other player, not warnings. Value sizing also changes with board texture. On coordinated boards, those with potential straights or flushes, you can size larger because opponents expect aggression. On dry, disconnected boards, smaller bets keep their weaker holdings interested. Position plays a role too. In position, you can afford smaller value bets because you control the action and gain extra streets of information. Out of position, larger bets prevent opponents from dictating tempo or taking free cards. Another concept is thin value, betting with hands that are only slightly ahead, like top pair with a weak kicker. Thin value relies on accurate sizing. Too large, and those worse hands fold. Too small, and you don't get compensated for risk. Thin value teaches discipline. It's how professionals squeeze profit from subtle edges. The key is consistency. Opponents recognize when your large bets always mean strength. Mix your value sizing with similar bluffs to avoid transparency. In the long run, consistent sizing keeps your range protected while still maximizing reward. Value betting is art built on logic. The math tells you what's profitable. The psychology tells you what's possible. Combining both lets every chip work a little harder for you. Chapter 4. Sizing for protection. Not every bet aims to extract value. Some aim to protect it. Protection betting prevents opponents from realizing their equity by pricing them out of draws or uncertain spots. It's not about greed, it's about denying opportunity. Protection becomes important when your hand is currently ahead but vulnerable to future cards. For example, you hold top pair on a wet board with 2 hearts and a straight draw. Betting too small invites free chances for improvement. Betting too large risks losing value from weaker hands. The protection bet lives in between. It charges opponents fairly for the chance to chase. Think of it as insurance against probability. Every draw your opponent holds carries a cost, measured in equity. Your job is to make sure they pay more than that cost to continue. If they call incorrectly, you profit mathematically, even if the draw hits occasionally. Protection betting also serves a psychological role. It sends a message of control. It reminds opponents that chasing will come at a price. This discourages speculative calls and helps stabilize your session variance over time. The correct protection size depends on board texture and number of opponents. On heavily coordinated boards, size up. More possible draws mean higher equity against you. Against a single player on a dry board, smaller protection bets suffice. They're paying to chase a far weaker set of outs. Protection also blends with value. Many strong hands double as protection bets. A top pair on a draw-heavy board is often both extracting value from second-best hands and protecting against future danger. Avoid the instinct to bet to protect in every uncertain spot. If your opponent's range is already weak or unlikely to improve, smaller sizing, or even checking, can be more profitable. Protection is only necessary when there's something real to protect against. Finally, remember that protection should never become panic. Overbetting to end the hand often backfires, folding out hands that would have paid you. Calm, proportional bets achieve the same goal with less risk. Protection betting is about balance, charging fairly, discouraging luck, and defending your position without fear. It's quiet control over chaos. When used correctly, protection sizing keeps your edge intact through every unpredictable turn of the deck. Chapter 5. Bluff Sizing Logic. Bluffing is not only about courage, it's about calibration. The size of your bluff determines its believability, and believability decides whether it succeeds. Bluff sizing is where psychology meets mathematics, combining story consistency with range balance. Every bluff tells a story. The bet size you choose must match that story. A small bet implies control or curiosity. A large bet represents conviction and polarization. When your bluff contradicts logic, observant players see through it instantly. The simplest rule of bluff sizing is consistency with your value range. If you normally bet 75% of the pot with strong hands, your bluffs must use similar sizing to remain credible. Once opponents detect a mismatch, large bets only with value, small bets only when weak, they can exploit you easily. Bluff sizing also depends on board texture. On dry flops with few draws, small bluffs are believable because strong hands don't need heavy protection. On dynamic boards with straights or flushes possible, Larger bluffs make sense because that's what your strong hands would do to protect equity. The board dictates the story, and your sizing writes the sentences. Mathematically, bluff sizing ties directly to risk and reward. The smaller you bet, the less often your bluff must succeed to be profitable. For example, bluffing half the pot only needs to work 1 in 3 times to break even. Bluffing the full pot must succeed half the time. Understanding these thresholds keeps bluffs disciplined instead of reckless. From a psychological standpoint, medium to large bluffs apply the most pressure because they force emotional decisions. Opponents dislike folding when curious, but they dislike losing big pots even more. A properly timed large bluff creates conflict between pride and fear, the exact tension where mistakes occur. Inversely, small bluffs can manipulate perception without major risk. They pick up uncontested pots, test reactions, and maintain aggression cheaply. Consistent small bluffs also build table image, setting up credibility for larger moves later. The true art of bluff sizing lies in balance. Too many small bluffs reveal timidity. Too many large bluffs reveal recklessness. Mixing sizes based on context makes your play unreadable and your story coherent. Bluff sizing is not about forcing folds. It's about giving opponents reasons to believe. When your numbers, timing, and tone align, the bluff becomes indistinguishable from truth. That's when it works. Chapter 6: Overbets and Polarization. An overbet, betting more than the pot, carries unique power in poker. It instantly shifts the emotional and mathematical balance of a hand. Used correctly, it polarizes your range, representing either very strong hands or complete bluffs. Mastering overbets adds a dangerous weapon to your arsenal, but it requires precise understanding. Overbets work because they distort pot odds. When you bet larger than the pot, you force opponents to risk more chips for the same potential reward. This magnifies pressure and creates difficult decisions. For example, a pot-sized bet offers your opponent 2-1 on a call. An overbet cuts that to roughly 1.5-1, demanding greater confidence to continue. The logic behind overbetting is polarization. You use this size only when your range consists of hands at opposite extremes, monsters and bluffs, with few medium-strength holdings. Betting big with middling hands exposes you to risk without purpose. Overbets also leverage fear. Large numbers trigger instinctive caution. Even experienced players hesitate when the pot grows beyond comfort. When your range advantage supports it, this fear becomes a profitable tool. For instance, after a dry turn that favors your pre-flop raising range, an overbet can force folds from second-best hands while setting up maximum value with your strongest holdings. However, the power of overbetting lies in credibility. You must represent a story that makes sense. Overbetting on boards that don't fit your supposed range destroys trust. For example, blasting the river on a board that heavily favors your opponent looks suspicious. But overbetting when you hold the nut advantage tells a coherent narrative. The risk of overbetting is overuse. Many players discover its success and begin firing too often, forgetting that the move's strength lies in rarity. When every large bet looks the same, opponents adapt and start calling lighter. From a mathematical view, overbets inflate future expected value when timed correctly. For your bluffs, they create fold equity. For your value hands, they maximize payout. But without range balance, they become transparent. Psychologically, overbets test emotional endurance. Watching large stacks slide across the felt unsettles even disciplined players. They begin questioning logic, second-guessing math, and often fold winning hands. Used sparingly, this discomfort becomes your edge. Overbetting is controlled aggression, raw power shaped by understanding. When you use it with balance and purpose, it doesn't just change the pot size. It changes the entire atmosphere of the table. Chapter 7. Small Bets for Control. Small bets are the subtle instruments of poker strategy. They manage pot size, gather information, and control tempo. While large bets create pressure, small bets create stability. They keep opponents guessing without risking too much of your stack. A small bet, often between 1/3 and 1/2 of the pot, serves several purposes. It sets the price of engagement, keeps weaker hands in the pot, and helps you navigate complex boards without overcommitting. Most importantly, it gives you control over the flow of information. Small bets define conversation. When you bet small, you invite response. You learn how opponents react under mild pressure, which reveals far more about their tendencies than an all-in shove ever could. A quick call might suggest curiosity or medium strength. A hesitant fold might signal uncertainty. Each reaction gives you data. Mathematically, small bets protect your risk-to-reward ratio. You're risking less to win more often, which keeps variance manageable. Over time, this steadiness preserves chips and prevents emotional swings. It's the strategy of accumulation rather than confrontation. From a range perspective, small bets are most effective on dry boards where neither player has many strong hands. On these textures, small continuation bets maintain fold equity without inflating the pot. Opponents who miss the board often surrender cheaply, giving you steady profit through repetition. Psychologically, small bets project confidence. They say, "I don't need to overprotect my hand." When executed consistently, they calm the table's rhythm and make opponents second-guess whether you're trapping or probing. This composure often leads to mistakes. Players call too light or bluff in frustration, giving you control. Small bets also build foundations for future streets. They keep your options open, allowing you to scale aggression later if conditions improve. Think of them as test balloons, light probes that prepare the air for stronger pressure later. The key is balance. Too many small bets can look weak, if not supported by larger ones in your overall strategy. Use them as punctuation, not as the whole sentence. In poker, small bets do not mean small thinking. They represent measured awareness, the art of staying in control when everyone else chases chaos. Chapter 8. Pot-sized bets and commitment. A pot-sized bet is the threshold where mathematics and psychology meet commitment. It's a moment that demands clarity, because when you bet the full pot, you're announcing serious intent. You're saying, "This hand matters." Pot-sized bets define inflection points in a hand. They signal strength, polarization, or decisive pressure. When you use them, you change the pot's geometry dramatically, shaping future decisions for both you and your opponent. Mathematically, a pot-sized bet offers your opponent 2-to-1 odds to call. This means they must win 1 out of every 3 times to break even. That ratio exerts pressure on their marginal holdings. Hands that might have called smaller bets now fold more often. Pot-sized betting also reduces post-flop flexibility. Once you invest that much, your remaining stack often becomes pot-committed. That's why these bets require planning. Professionals don't use them by instinct. they map them as part of a multi-street design. Pot-sized bets shine when you hold strong value hands and want to maximize returns before draws resolve. They also work as high-leverage bluffs, representing polarized ranges where your story fits the board perfectly. The larger the bet, the more believable the strength, if the narrative makes sense. Psychologically, pot-sized bets shift tension to the opponent. The visual weight of chips alone alters decision-making. Many players freeze under that pressure, second-guessing their earlier reads. Even confident opponents pause when the pot suddenly doubles in scale. Still, the power of pot-sized betting carries responsibility. Overuse drains credibility. If every pot you play escalates to maximum size, your opponents adapt by calling more often or trapping with strong holdings. Pot-sized aggression works best when contrasted with smaller bets in other hands. It must feel significant, not routine. Another consideration is stack-to-pot ratio. When stacks are shallow, pot-sized bets effectively commit you. When stacks are deep, they become a controlled display of dominance. Know which environment you're in before you fire. Used correctly, pot-sized betting defines structure. It's not about raw aggression, it's about timing, intention, and emotional control. When you bet the pot, you're making a statement. You're telling your opponent that from this point forward, hesitation has a cost. Chapter 9. Sizing across streets. Each hand of poker is a story told in 3 acts: flop, turn, and river. Bet sizing across these streets determines not only how that story unfolds, but also how believable it feels. Proper sequencing allows you to build pots naturally, while keeping your range consistent and your strategy balanced. Think of your bet sizes as linked steps in a staircase. Each street's bet determines the geometry of the next. If you start too small, you may reach the river with a pot too small to apply meaningful pressure. If you start too large, you may find yourself pot committed too early, or forced into awkward overbets that strain credibility. The key is progression. A simple but powerful structure uses a percentage model. For example, betting 75% of the pot on the flop, then the same again on the turn. This consistent pattern ensures that by the river, the pot is large enough to support a decisive move. Professionals rely on these geometric progressions to manage stack-to-pot ratio, while maintaining flexibility. Sizing across streets also shapes your range narrative. Small bets early, followed by large ones later, often tell a story of building confidence, a believable pattern for strong hands or well-timed bluffs. Conversely, large early bets followed by smaller ones suggest fading confidence, which may induce opponents to test your resolve. Adapting your sizing rhythm to board texture sharpens control. On dry flops, start small to preserve elasticity. On wet flops, begin larger to deny equity. By the turn and river, your previous bets give context. Every size you choose adds a new chapter to your hand's story. Psychologically, consistent sizing reassures observant opponents that your actions make sense. That perceived coherence makes your bluffs more credible and your value bets more profitable. Disjointed sizing, however, confuses your story, something sharp opponents will exploit. Finally, remember that sizing across streets is not rigid mathematics, it's flexible architecture. You adjust based on how opponents react, stack depth, and changing board dynamics. The structure gives you balance, observation gives you adaptability. When you control the size of the pot across streets, you control the flow of the game. Every chip you invest becomes part of a rhythm that others unconsciously follow. Chapter 10. Stack Depth Adjustments. Stack depth transforms the meaning of every bet size. What feels standard at one depth becomes reckless or timid at another. Advanced players understand that bet sizing is always relative to chip stacks, pot size, and psychological context. When stacks are deep, you have more room for maneuvering. Larger effective stacks encourage post-flop creativity because there's more value to extract and more space for mistakes. Deep stacks make smaller bets attractive early, allowing you to build pots gradually and maintain flexibility for future bluffs or thin value bets. The goal is to control volatility while preserving the ability to apply pressure later. Deep play also rewards polarized sizing. With room to maneuver, you can use larger bets to represent strong ranges or bluffs credibly. The extra depth protects your risk because you're not committing your stack in a single move. Conversely, short stacks demand precision. When you're working with limited chips, each bet moves you closer to commitment. Small miscalculations compound quickly. In these situations, smaller sizing pre-flop and on the flop preserves fold equity while leaving space for later aggression. Overbetting early with shallow stacks eliminates flexibility and exposes you to easy counterplays. Stack depth also determines your SPR, stack-to-pot ratio, which influences every sizing decision. Low SPR hands, such as top pair with strong kicker, benefit from straightforward value betting and fewer bluffs. High SPR hands, like deep stack draws or speculative holdings, reward careful sizing and longer planning. Psychologically, deep stacks increase pressure because mistakes become costlier. Players tighten subconsciously, valuing control over confrontation. Shallow stacks create urgency, often pushing players toward all-in decisions that simplify analysis. Recognizing this emotional shift helps you tailor your own bet sizing to exploit their discomfort. In tournaments, stack depth constantly changes with blinds. Adjusting on the fly separates skilled players from mechanical ones. Always anchor your sizing logic to effective stacks, not arbitrary percentages. Stack depth doesn't just dictate risk, it defines tone. Deep stacks allow storytelling and subtlety. Short stacks demand directness and courage. When you align your bet sizing with the depth of play, every action feels proportionate, balanced, and intentional. That's what separates structured thinking from reactive play. Chapter 11. Position and Sizing Advantage. Position shapes everything in poker, including how you size your bets. Acting last gives you more information, more control, and greater freedom to manipulate pot size. Bet sizing from position is both art and precision. It allows you to manage risk while maximizing pressure. When you're in position, you see how your opponent acts before you make your decision. This extra knowledge reduces uncertainty, which means you can size bets more efficiently. Smaller bets often accomplish the same goals that would require larger bets out of position. You don't need to force folds, you can guide the hand instead. For example, on the flop, betting 1/3 to 1/2 of the pot in position often maintains fold equity while keeping your range balanced. Opponents must still respond, yet you risk less. Because you'll act last on later streets, you can collect more data and adjust accordingly. This control compounds over time. It's how professionals stretch small advantages into lasting profit. Out of position, the opposite dynamic applies. Without the privilege of seeing your opponent's next move, you face uncertainty. Larger bets become necessary to protect information and reclaim initiative. Betting 3/4 of the pot, or more often, discourages floating or delayed aggression. You're paying for control through sizing. Position also affects perceived credibility. Bets made in position carry more weight because they appear thoughtful, based on extra data. Bets out of position often appear defensive or forced, even when they're not. Skilled players use this bias to their advantage, representing confidence through well-timed in-position bets that fit the board texture and stack geometry. Psychologically, opponents hate being out of position. They feel chased, reactive, and pressured. Using smaller, well-placed bets from position amplifies that discomfort while minimizing your own exposure. The more often they defend against controlled aggression, the more mistakes they make. From a strategic standpoint, your overall range structure changes with position. In position, your bluffs increase because your control compensates for risk. Out of position, you focus more on value, using larger sizes to simplify play. This difference defines advanced bet sizing. It's not just numbers, it's narrative control. Position is the foundation of advantage. When you size correctly based on who acts last, you turn information into equity. You're no longer playing your cards, you're playing the rhythm of time itself. Chapter 12. Range-based sizing theory. Bet sizing becomes truly advanced when you stop thinking in terms of single hands and start thinking in ranges. Range-based sizing theory aligns your bet sizes with the distribution of all possible hands you could hold. This keeps your strategy balanced, your bluffs believable, and your opponents guessing. In range theory, every action you take must make sense for your entire range, not just the exact hand you're holding. If your bet size matches only your strong hands, opponents will notice and adjust. But when your size fits both your value and your bluffs proportionally, they can't exploit you. Imagine a scenario where you bet 75% of the pot with your strongest hands and half pot with bluffs. Over time, observant players learn that larger bets mean danger and smaller bets mean weakness. Range-based sizing prevents this. You use the same size for both categories, creating indifference in your opponent's decision-making. The concept ties closely to equity distribution. When your range has more high-equity hands than your opponent's, meaning more strong combinations on that board, you can size up confidently. When your range has fewer, you size smaller to reduce exposure. It's a direct reflection of mathematical advantage. Range-based thinking also brings structure to multi-street planning. You design your betting tree ahead of time, choosing how often and how large to bet with each segment of your range. This keeps your actions consistent across the flop, turn, and river. A balanced sizing tree prevents emotional decision-making mid-hand. Mathematically, range-based sizing aligns with expected value and minimum defense frequency principles. When your sizes stay consistent, your bluff-to-value ratio naturally aligns with optimal play. You force opponents to defend just enough to remain indifferent, making your strategy mathematically sound. From a psychological perspective, range-based sizing protects your story. It ensures every hand, weak or strong, fits the same narrative framework. Opponents looking for patterns find none, because every move fits within balanced logic. The challenge of range-based sizing lies in discipline. Emotional players adjust sizes impulsively. Professionals stick to structure, using logic to build consistency over time. This discipline turns randomness into rhythm. Range-based sizing transforms chaos into clarity. It's the bridge between mathematics and psychology, between control and deception. Once mastered, it gives you the ultimate advantage: predictability in your process and unpredictability in your play. Chapter 13. Exploitative sizing adjustments. Balance is powerful, but poker is not played in a vacuum. Once you understand theoretically sound sizing, the next step is learning when and how to break those rules. Exploitative sizing adjustments let you capitalize on your opponent's weaknesses instead of adhering strictly to equilibrium play. The foundation of exploitation is observation. You can only adjust when you know what your opponent consistently does wrong. Some players fold too much. Others call too often. Some react emotionally to big bets, while others overdefend small ones. Your goal is to identify these tendencies and bend your sizing to exploit them. When opponents overfold, increase your bluff sizing. Large bets apply pressure they cannot handle. They'll fold hands they should call, handing you extra profit. Conversely, when players underfold, calling far too often, reduce bluff sizes or eliminate bluffs entirely. Instead, size up for value. Make them pay dearly for their curiosity. Calling stations, who chase any draw or pair, are best attacked with large value bets and minimal bluffing. Tight passive players who fold at the first sign of aggression can be crushed with frequent medium-sized bluffs. Aggressive regulars, who analyze sizing closely, can be tricked with asymmetrical adjustments, using smaller bets for strong hands and larger ones for marginal holdings to reverse expectations. Exploitative sizing also adjusts by situation. Against emotional opponents on tilt, larger bets feed on frustration. Against nervous players protecting short stacks, small bets create comfort that leads to predictable mistakes. Mathematically, exploitation deviates from balanced ratios, but the gain in expected value offsets the imbalance, if used selectively. The danger is becoming predictable again. Once opponents notice your adjustments, they can counter-adjust. That's why exploitation must remain fluid and subtle. Psychologically, exploitative sizing tests emotional stability. When used too aggressively, it breeds arrogance or carelessness. When used thoughtfully, it feels invisible, just natural adaptation. The best players adjust without appearing to change anything at all. Exploitative play is poker's living art. You start with theory, then adapt to people. The numbers give you structure. The human element gives you profit. Balance keeps you safe. Exploitation makes you rich. Chapter 14: Sizing Errors and Common Leaks. Even skilled players lose chips through poor sizing. Bet sizing errors often go unnoticed because they don't look like mistakes in the moment. They look like habits. Understanding and correcting these leaks saves more money than any advanced concept ever will. The first major leak is betting too large, too often. Many players equate aggression with dominance. They overbet flops, turns, or rivers without purpose, inflating pots when smaller bets would achieve the same goal. This habit makes their bluffs expensive and their value hands transparent. The second leak is the opposite, betting too small for value. Fear of losing customers leads players to underprice strong hands. They invite calls, but leave profit on the table. Value betting should stretch the comfort zone of your opponents, not coddle it. A third common leak is unbalanced sizing between value and bluff ranges. When your large bets always mean strength, and your small bets always mean weakness, you become easy to read. Even less experienced opponents eventually catch on. Consistency keeps your story believable. Another subtle mistake is ignoring stack depth. Players use the same sizes regardless of chip count, failing to adjust for geometry. This oversight leads to awkward commitments or missed value opportunities later. Bet sizing is relative, never absolute. Psychological leaks matter too. Some players downsize after losing a pot, afraid to risk chips again. Others upsize in anger, trying to regain control through force. Emotional sizing gives away your mindset more than any tell. Calm consistency conceals information and projects strength. Avoid the urge to end hands early through large protection bets. This instinct stems from discomfort, not logic. Protection is about balance, not elimination. Overprotecting drives away value, hands, and distorts your range. The best way to fix sizing leaks is through hand review. After each session, revisit big pots and ask, was that size aligned with my goal? Over time, you'll notice recurring patterns, bets made out of fear, impatience, or habit. Awareness turns unconscious, leaks into conscious choices. Correct sizing does not always mean bigger or smaller. It means correct for the situation, stack, and opponent. Poker rewards precision. Every chip you save through discipline adds up quietly over time. The difference between a good player and a great one is rarely a single massive pot. It's a lifetime of avoided leaks. Chapter 15. Using sizing to tell a story. Every poker hand is a narrative. The cards are the characters, the board is the setting, and your bet sizing is the tone that makes the story believable. The best players use size not only to express strength or weakness, but to tell a coherent story that aligns with logic and emotion alike. A believable story follows continuity. The same way a movie builds tension through pacing, poker tells its story through sizing across streets. Small bets early suggest cautious exploration. Larger bets later suggest conviction. When your sizing progression mirrors a logical hand narrative, opponents instinctively trust it. The first rule of storytelling through sizing is consistency of intent. If you bet small on the flop and large on the turn, your story says, I improved. If you bet large early and slow down later, your story says, I lost confidence. Both patterns can be true or false, but they must make sense within the context of the board and your perceived range. Random sizing confuses the story, and confused stories don't get believed. Bet sizing also reflects character development. Each street deepens your representation of the hand you claim to hold. Bluffing as though you're strong means staying consistent in size and rhythm. Value betting requires the same discipline. The difference is emotional. It's about how convincing you sound through numbers. The most powerful stories use subtle misdirection. You tell a believable tale, but with a hidden twist. For instance, on a dry board where small bets are normal, a slightly larger bet can suggest strength while actually being a bluff. Because it fits within the established tone, it feels natural to your audience. Your story must also match board texture. A sudden overbet on a safe board feels false unless it connects with prior aggression. But on a dangerous turn card that shifts the range advantage, an overbet feels authentic. Context creates credibility. From a psychological view, storytelling through sizing engages emotion. Players don't make decisions solely through math. They react to rhythm, flow, and comfort. When your betting rhythm feels consistent, they follow your lead. When it feels off, they resist. The goal is not deception, it's believability. The best stories don't feel forced. They feel inevitable. Poker rewards those who tell stories that make sense. When your bet sizes match your narrative, you control not only the pot, but the perception of truth itself. Chapter 16. Reverse Engineering Opponents' Sizing. While you build your own stories, others are building theirs. The ability to reverse engineer bet sizing, to decode the logic behind an opponent's choices, is one of the most valuable reading skills in advanced poker. Every player has habits. Some use consistent percentages, others size emotionally. By studying their patterns, you can reconstruct their thinking and predict future behavior. The key is paying attention not to single actions, but to relationships between actions. Start with flop sizing. A player who always continuation bets 1/3 of the pot is likely following a structured range-based approach. They're thinking logically. In contrast, a player who fluctuates between small and large bets on similar boards is making decisions emotionally, reacting to texture or fear. Recognizing this tells you whether their strategy is grounded or reactive. Next, observe turn and river sizing patterns. Does your opponent increase sizing dramatically on scare cards? That might indicate they're bluffing, leveraging fear rather than value. Do they reduce sizing on safe cards? That often means they're betting for thin value and don't want to lose customers. The secret to decoding opponents is context. For example, a large bet from a tight player means something very different than the same size from a loose aggressive one. The numbers are identical, but the personalities behind them are not. Pay attention to timing as well. Quick, automatic small bets usually signal habit. Long pauses before large bets suggest deliberation, often value. The combination of size, timing, and posture tells a consistent story about mindset. Reverse engineering also applies to online play. If you track hand histories, look for recurring size ratios. A player who uses 75% pot on every value hand, but half pot when bluffing, becomes predictable. Even in digital environments, sizing reveals truth through repetition. The most important step is empathy, thinking as they think. Ask yourself, if I were in their seat with this hand and this image, what size would I choose? This thought exercise turns analysis into intuition, bridging the gap between theory and emotion. Psychologically, reading opponents' sizing builds quiet confidence. You stop reacting to fear or surprise. Each bet becomes a sentence in their story, and you already know how it ends. When you understand why others size the way they do, poker becomes clearer. Their logic exposes their limits. Their habits become your map. Reverse engineering sizing is not guesswork, it's translation. Once you learn the language, every bet begins to speak. Chapter 17. The math behind expected value. Every decision in poker, including how much to bet, can be measured through expected value, often shortened to EV. Understanding EV transforms bet sizing from intuition into logic. It's the mathematical backbone of why one bet size earns more than another over time. Expected value measures the average profit or loss of a decision if repeated infinitely. A positive EV means your action makes money in the long run. A negative EV means it loses. The size of your bet determines both the potential reward and the risk of achieving it. To visualize this, imagine you're bluffing with a half-pot bet. You risk 50 chips to win 100. If your opponent folds more than 1/3 of the time, your bluff is profitable. That's because your win rate offsets the times you're called and lose. If you increase your bluff to a pot-sized bet, risking 100 to win 100, you now need your opponent to fold more than half the time to maintain the same profit. This simple ratio defines fold equity, the percentage of time your opponent must fold for your bet to break even. Smaller bets require less fold equity. Larger bets demand more. This balance guides both bluffs and value bets. For value, EV focuses on maximizing calls from worse hands. Suppose you have top pair and believe your opponent will call a 50-chip bet half the time, but a 75-chip bet only 1/3 of the time. You compare outcomes. 50-chip bet times 0.5 equals 25 chips expected. 75-chip bet times 0.33 equals roughly 25 chips expected. Both yield similar EV, but if the larger bet also prevents future bluffs, it may hold secondary benefits. This illustrates how math supports judgment rather than replacing it. EV also helps evaluate multi-street planning. Each street's bet alters future potential value. A smaller flop bet may create more profitable turn and river scenarios. A large early bet might secure immediate value, but reduce long-term gain. EV isn't static, it's a living measurement that adapts as the hand evolves. Emotion often distorts EV. Players overestimate fold equity when bluffing or underestimate it when afraid. Using clear math removes bias and anchors decisions to truth. In poker, emotion feels immediate. Mathematics feels patient. Bet sizing mastery requires both: the courage to trust logic and the awareness to know when human behavior makes logic bend. Expected value is not about predicting outcomes. It's about understanding why certain outcomes pay better than others. When you size with EV in mind, you stop chasing luck and start building equity. Chapter 18: Multiway Pot Sizing. When multiple players see the flop, every sizing decision changes in weight and meaning. Multiway pots create new dynamics where risk compounds and simple strategies collapse. Bet sizing in these situations requires awareness of shared psychology, range overlap, and reduced fold equity. The first rule of multiway sizing is caution. With more opponents, the chance someone holds a strong hand increases significantly. Your bluffs lose power because each additional player adds potential resistance. This means smaller, more conservative bet sizes are generally optimal. Smaller bets keep your risk proportional to your fold equity. You're unlikely to push out 3 or 4 players with a single large bet, so risking heavily without strong equity is inefficient. Instead, focus on value extraction and protection, not pressure. When betting for value, you must also consider targeting. Ask, who am I betting against? In multi-way pots, you're rarely betting against the entire field. You're betting against the range of 1 or 2 specific opponents who are most likely to continue. Your sizing should reflect that focus. Mathematically, the correct size shrinks as the number of opponents grows. On a 3-way flop, 1/3 pot bets keep ranges wide without overcommitting. On a 4-way board, even smaller bets, around 1/4, maintain balance. This scaling ensures you retain flexibility across future streets. Psychologically, multi-way pots tighten emotion. Players fear elimination and often fold marginal holdings sooner. You can use small, confident bets to collect dead money without escalating variance. However, once someone calls, respect the signal. Continuing aggression without real strength becomes expensive quickly. Position remains critical. In position, small bets control tempo and let you watch how others react. Out of position, consider checking more often. Large bets without visibility invite danger. Avoid polarization in multi-way pots. Extreme sizing makes less sense because value and bluff frequencies narrow. Instead, prioritize thin value and protection, bets that advance the hand's logic without overexposing yourself. Multi-way bet sizing is like navigating a crowded street. Speed and aggression give way to spacing and awareness. You act deliberately, not impulsively. By staying proportionate and patient, you survive volatility while capitalizing on others' missteps. In multi-way play, discipline beats daring. Chapter 19: Tournament versus Cash Game Sizing. Bet sizing changes drastically between tournaments and cash games. The math may be the same, but the goals are not. Cash games reward consistent expected value. Tournaments reward survival and adaptation. Understanding these differences ensures your sizing choices fit the environment you're playing in. In cash games, stacks are deep and replenishable. Players rebuy, blinds stay constant, and every chip equals direct value. This stability allows for flexible sizing. You can vary bet sizes across streets to maximize long-term profit, without fear of elimination. Bluffing is frequent, thin value bets are common, and pot geometry matters more than preservation. Since the goal is maximizing profit, larger bet sizes often dominate cash strategy. You can apply heavy pressure with deep stacks, build pots with strong hands, and still recover from losses. Players adjust to math, not emotion. A balanced range of bet sizes, half pot, three-quarter pot, or pot-sized bets, keeps your play consistent and mathematically sound. In tournaments, everything changes. Chips have unequal value because of the potential to bust. One lost pot can mean elimination, so risk carries more emotional and strategic weight. Bet sizing shrinks as a result. Small bets control variance, protect stack depth, and preserve fold equity. Early in a tournament, with deep stacks, sizing resembles cash play. But as blinds rise, stacks shorten, and ICM pressure, the value of survival near pay jumps, forces smaller, more calculated bets. A one-third pot continuation bet that might seem timid in cash becomes standard in tournament play, keeping options open for future streets. In late stages, aggression returns, but with purpose. Short stacks commit easily, and large bets regain power. However, tournament players balance this aggression with stack preservation, knowing every decision affects longevity. Psychologically, tournament sizing also manipulates perception. Small bets look defensive, inviting light calls. Large bets project dominance, scaring opponents conscious of elimination. Understanding these emotional shifts is as vital as mastering the numbers. When transitioning between formats, remember, cash rewards exploitation, tournaments reward endurance. In cash, aim to extract. In tournaments, aim to survive and capitalize. Sizing isn't just mathematical, it's situational. The environment changes the meaning of every number you choose. Chapter 20: Sizing and Table Image. Bet sizing doesn't exist in isolation. It interacts with your table image, the perception other players form about your style, confidence, and risk tolerance. Your image is the lens through which every bet is interpreted. Mastering this relationship allows you to control how others respond before you even act. A tight image makes your bets believable. When opponents see you as disciplined, they assume large bets represent strength and small bets represent curiosity. You can use this credibility to steal pots with minimal resistance. However, the same reputation reduces the payout from strong hands. No one wants to call the player who always has it. A loose image flips that dynamic. When opponents think you're wild, They pay off your big hands and test your bluffs. Bet sizing in this context becomes psychological misdirection. Smaller bets under this image seem weak but may hide strength. Large bets seem reckless, but may actually demand respect. Managing image means shaping your sizing patterns to fit your reputation, or to contradict it deliberately. Early in a session, build an identity. Play solid and consistent. Once others believe in your style, use that belief against them. A single unexpected sizing, too large or too small, creates confusion, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew. Table image also guides exploitative adjustments. Against players who overreact to aggression, downsize your bluffs. Against those who assume weakness from small bets, use those spots to extract thin value. Your reputation turns into leverage, making each bet more effective. Psychologically, consistent sizing builds trust. Inconsistent sizing builds fear. Both have uses depending on the situation. A calm, steady rhythm disarms opponents. Erratic, unpredictable sizing makes them cautious. The key is control. You choose which emotion you evoke. Your image evolves with every showdown, every pot won or lost. Guard it like a resource. Avoid emotional reactions that undo your narrative. Frustration or overcorrection makes you transparent. In poker, image is as real as cards. When your sizing supports the version of yourself you want others to see, they stop playing against your range and start playing against your persona. Chapter 21. Sizing in bluff-catching scenarios. Bet sizing doesn't only apply to aggression, it also guides how you respond when facing it. In bluff-catching situations, the size of your opponent's bet defines the risk, the math, and the psychology of your call. Learning how to interpret and react to those sizes separates disciplined players from hopeful ones. A bluff catch happens when you hold a medium-strength hand, too weak to value bet, too strong to fold. The goal isn't to beat value hands, it's to catch bluffs at the right frequency. Understanding how bet sizing reflects range strength helps you make those razor-thin calls profitably. Start with the math. Every call you make must meet a minimum success rate to break even. For example, if your opponent bets half the pot, you're getting 3-1 on a call. That means you must win at least 25% of the time to justify it. If they bet the full pot, you need to win 33%. Knowing these thresholds prevents emotion from dictating your choices. Sizing also reveals range polarization. Small bets usually indicate medium-strength hands, value-seeking but not confident. Large bets often represent polarized ranges, either very strong hands or complete bluffs. Against those polarized bets, bluff catching becomes clearer. If you suspect your opponent bluffs too often with large sizes, calling becomes profitable. Psychologically, the decision to call tests your confidence. Big bet sizes intimidate. They create fear of being wrong. But disciplined bluff catchers rely on evidence, not emotion. They remember previous showdowns, frequencies, and table image. The calm player who trusts data rather than instinct consistently saves or earns chips through these calls. Your own table image affects bluff catching too. Aggressive opponents will bluff you more often if they believe you fold easily. Tight players receive fewer bluffs because their calls carry credibility. Adjust your calling frequency based on how opponents perceive you, not just on cards. Finally, understand that bluff catching is not about ego. The best players fold often, and they do so proudly when math dictates it. But when logic and range analysis confirm that your hand sits near the top of your defensive range, calling becomes not a guess, but a necessity. Bluff-catching is courage, refined by math. When bet sizing tells you the story, and logic confirms it, trust the numbers. The truth often hides in the size of the bet itself. Chapter 22. Minimum defense frequency and sizing balance. Every bet you face puts your range to the test. If you fold too often, your opponent profits automatically. If you call too often, you bleed chips. The balance between these extremes is defined by minimum defense frequency, or MDF, a core concept that connects bet sizing to mathematical equilibrium. Minimum defense frequency tells you how often you must continue, either by calling or raising, to prevent opponents from bluffing profitably. It's not about guessing hands, it's about denying them free equity. The formula is simple. MDF equals 1 minus the bet size divided by the pot plus the bet size. If your opponent bets half the pot, plug in the numbers. 1 minus 0.5 divided by 1.5 equals 0.67, or about 67%. That means you should defend roughly 2/3 of your range to keep them indifferent to bluffing. If they bet the full pot, the math changes. 1 minus 1 divided by 2 equals 0.5, or 50%. In that case, you only need to defend half the time because their risk is higher. These ratios explain why larger bets generate fold equity. Your required defense shrinks as their risk grows. Understanding this relationship helps you calibrate bet sizing for both value and bluffing. In practice, MDF isn't a rigid rule. It's a framework. Against opponents who underbluff, you can fold more often. Against those who overbluff, you defend beyond equilibrium. But knowing the baseline allows you to deviate intelligently, instead of guessing. From a psychological standpoint, MDF offers emotional balance. Many players feel fear when facing large bets or guilt when folding too often. MDF replaces emotion with structure. You stop reacting and start reasoning. For your own bets, MDF teaches how to balance your bluff-to-value ratio. If you know how often opponents must defend, you can build bluffs accordingly. For example, if they must defend 67% of the time, structure your range so that 1/3 of your bets are bluffs. This keeps your opponents mathematically indifferent, unable to exploit your frequency. MinDF connects the mental and mathematical sides of poker. It's not just a formula, it's equilibrium in action. When you understand how size defines balance, you gain full control of pressure, expectation, and perception. Poker mastery begins where emotion ends, and proportion begins. MDF is the line that keeps both in harmony. Chapter 23. Advanced Sizing Sequences. At the highest levels of poker, players don't just pick bet sizes, they design sequences. An advanced sizing sequence is a planned series of bets that communicate strength, balance, or deception across multiple streets. It's how elite players build consistent stories that hold mathematical and psychological integrity. Every sizing sequence begins with a goal. Are you trying to build a pot for value, apply progressive pressure, or represent a specific range narrative? Once that goal is clear, the rest of the hand becomes architecture. Each bet size supports the next. A common example of a deliberate sequence is escalation sizing, starting with smaller bets and increasing on later streets. This structure feels natural to opponents because it mirrors logical progression. When you bet small on the flop, larger on the turn, and big on the river, the story says, I started cautiously and gained confidence. That rhythm is believable for both value hands and bluffs. The opposite, front-loaded sizing, begins with large bets early and smaller ones later. This approach builds tension quickly and can disguise weakness. By committing chips up front, you discourage light calls early while saving flexibility for future streets. It's risky, but when balanced correctly, it creates discomfort in opponents who expect the standard progression. Some professionals use alternating sequences, mixing large and small bets across similar board types, to stay unreadable. This breaks pattern recognition and prevents opponents from associating size with hand strength. However, it requires deep discipline. Inconsistency without purpose is chaos, not strategy. From a mathematical standpoint, advanced sequences preserve pot geometry while adapting to board texture. For instance, when a flop bet sets up a perfect pot-sized shove on the river, you've maintained logical geometry while telling a coherent story. Every number supports both narrative and range. Psychologically, sizing sequences affect emotional pacing. Small bets invite comfort, large bets create stress. A well-timed sequence alternates those sensations to control momentum. You dictate the hand's rhythm, guiding opponents between calm and pressure without them realizing it. In advanced play, size becomes language. The sequence of your bets writes paragraphs of meaning. When structure and story align, your opponents don't just read your line, they believe it. Chapter 24. Combining Math and Psychology. Bet sizing sits at the intersection of two worlds, mathematics and psychology. One governs structure, the other governs emotion. When you combine both, you create decisions that are not only profitable, but persuasive. Mathematics defines the framework. It tells you what sizes make sense, what ratios protect your range, and how to maximize expected value. Psychology defines the application, how those same sizes influence the thoughts and feelings of others. A perfect bet is one that satisfies both. For example, a half-pot bluff works mathematically because it needs to succeed 1 in 3 times. Psychologically, it works because it feels small enough to be called, creating false comfort. A pot-sized value bet works mathematically because it extracts maximum return from strong hands. Psychologically, it works because it projects power and demands respect. The best players adjust their sizing not only to equations but to personalities. Against a logical opponent, they lean on math. Against an emotional opponent, they lean on pressure and perception. Both approaches exist within the same structure, only the emphasis shifts. Combining math and psychology also means understanding how people misinterpret numbers. A bet of 100 chips in a 100-chip pot feels different than a bet of 400 in a 600-chip pot, even if the ratios are similar. Emotion magnifies numbers, and skilled players use this distortion to shape reactions. When logic and emotion align, every bet carries credibility. The numbers make sense, the story feels real. When they clash, your strategy breaks down. An overbet that fits the math but contradicts the narrative confuses your opponent and often yourself. Practically, this combination comes down to awareness. You calculate first, then empathize. You choose the size that fits the math, then refine it based on how it will be perceived. This dual process keeps you grounded while remaining adaptable. Poker is not won by logic alone or by instinct alone. It's won by those who understand both. Mathematics gives clarity. Psychology gives persuasion. When these two forces move together, your bet sizing becomes complete, logical enough to be correct, human enough to be believed. Chapter 25. Lesson Recap. Bet sizing is the heartbeat of poker strategy. Every decision, from a small continuation bet to an all-in shove, tells a story about intention, balance, and control. Over the past lessons, you've learned that the amount you wager carries more meaning than the cards themselves. It shapes perception, emotion, and mathematical outcome all at once. We began by exploring the purpose of bet sizing, how it influences pot odds, psychology, and storytelling. You learned that sizing is language. Small bets invite conversation, while large bets command attention. Every chip you place in the pot becomes part of your strategic dialogue. We discussed pot geometry, the structure that connects one street to the next. Proper planning ensures smooth transitions between flop, turn, and river, maintaining balance between value and risk. You saw how strong players build pots with intent, never improvisation. You learned to size for value, finding the delicate balance that maximizes profit without driving opponents away. You studied protection bets, which safeguard vulnerable hands without panic, and bluff sizing, where consistency transforms deception into credibility. We explored the emotional extremes of poker, overbets, small control bets, and pot-sized commitments, and how each affects the rhythm of a hand. You discovered that structure and emotion coexist in every action. You also examined position, stack depth, and range-based theory, seeing how each variable changes the meaning of your numbers. The math behind expected value and minimum defense frequency showed that sizing is not guesswork, it's measured equilibrium. Finally, you bridged the human side of poker with logic, learning how to exploit opponents, read their sizing patterns, and combine math with psychology. You saw that the best decisions emerge not from fear or instinct alone, but from disciplined harmony between the two. The central lesson is this: sizing is intention. Every bet must have a reason to extract value, apply pressure, or balance your range. When your sizes match your goals, your play becomes seamless. Mastering bet sizing doesn't mean memorizing numbers. It means understanding proportion, perception, and flow. When you achieve that, every hand you play becomes an act of precision. Chapter 26. Looking ahead to tournament strategy. In the next lesson, we'll move from bet sizing into tournament strategy, where structure, pressure, and survival redefine every decision you've learned so far. Tournaments transform poker into a living ecosystem. Blinds rise, stacks shrink, and each chip gains emotional and mathematical value. Concepts like pot control, aggression, and risk tolerance take on new meaning when one mistake can end your run. Where cash games reward steady optimization, tournaments reward adaptation. You'll learn how to adjust your bet sizing and range construction under different stack depths and ICM pressure. You'll see how early-stage freedom gives way to short-stack discipline, and how aggression near the bubble can turn fear into opportunity. We'll study blind dynamics, push-fold logic, and pressure application in high-leverage spots. You'll understand how to adjust your bet sizing, not just for math, but for survival and advancement. Most importantly, you'll learn how tournament strategy integrates everything you've built so far: emotional control, sizing balance, and logical discipline under real pressure. If bet sizing taught you precision, tournament play will teach you timing. One builds skill. The other tests it.